When Ukrainian drones started hitting targets around the Caspian Sea, 800 miles from the nearest Ukrainian territory, I knew we'd crossed a threshold that changes everything about European energy security. This isn't just about Ukraine extending its strike range or Russia losing some infrastructure. This is about the moment when Europe realized that Russian energy blackmail is now a two-way street, and when Europeans can't count on energy imports from anyone, they start building nuclear reactors. Let me explain why a few drone strikes in the middle of nowhere just accelerated Europe's return to nuclear power by about a decade. The Caspian Sea sits at the geographic heart of the Eurasian energy system. It's not just about what's underneath it, though the oil and gas reserves are substantial. It's about what passes through it and around it. The Caspian is where Russian energy exports from Siberia meet Central Asian energy flows, where pipeline networks converge, and where Moscow's entire strategy for energy dominance over Europe gets processed and packaged. For the past 20 years, Russia's grand strategy has been breathtakingly simple. Control the energy flows that keep European industry running, and Europeans will never seriously challenge Russian territorial ambitions. It worked beautifully until February 2022. But now Ukraine is demonstrating that Russian energy infrastructure is a lot more vulnerable than Moscow ever admitted to itself. When Ukrainian forces hit targets near Astrakhan, they weren't just blowing up some random industrial facilities. They were proving that Russia's entire energy export system is within reach of Ukrainian weapons. And if Ukraine can hit it, Ukraine can shut it down. The Europeans are paying attention, very close attention. Here's what most analysis misses about European energy policy. It's not driven by environmental ideology or carbon reduction targets. Those are nice talking points for politicians, but the real driver is geographic vulnerability. Europe imports about 60% of its energy needs. That's not a policy choice, that's geology. Europe doesn't have enough domestic energy resources to run a modern industrial economy. For decades, Europeans thought they could manage this vulnerability through diversification and diplomacy. They built pipeline networks connecting to Russia, Norway, Algeria, and the Middle East. They developed spot market trading systems that could route energy from anywhere to anywhere else. They convinced themselves that energy interdependence would prevent major conflicts because nobody would want to disrupt such a profitable system. The Ukraine war ended those comfortable illusions permanently. Energy interdependence doesn't prevent conflicts, it just makes the conflicts more expensive. And when the conflicts start, your energy infrastructure becomes a target, not a stabilizing force. Now, Ukrainian drones are hitting Russian energy infrastructure in the Caspian region, proving that energy systems built for peacetime efficiency are catastrophically vulnerable in wartime. Every pipeline, every processing facility, every distribution hub becomes a potential target for anyone with sufficient motivation and moderately advanced weapons technology. The Europeans are doing the math, and the math is terrifying. If Ukraine can hit Russian energy infrastructure from 800 miles away, imagine what Russia could do to European energy infrastructure if they really wanted to escalate. Europe's gas storage facilities, pipeline networks, and import terminals are a lot closer to Russian territory than the Caspian Sea is to Ukraine. But here's the strategic shift that changes everything. Europe is realizing that energy security isn't about having reliable suppliers. It's about having suppliers that can't be easily disrupted by military action. And in an increasingly unstable world, that means domestic energy production. The problem is that Europe doesn't have enough oil and gas reserves to matter. What they do have is the technology and industrial base to build nuclear power plants. Lots of nuclear power plants. And nuclear fuel, unlike natural gas, doesn't flow through pipelines that can be bombed or shut off for political reasons. France figured this out 40 years ago. After the oil shocks of the 1970s, the French built enough nuclear capacity to export electricity to their neighbors. Today, France generates about 70% of its electricity from nuclear power and has some of the most reliable and affordable energy in Europe. More importantly, France's energy security doesn't depend on maintaining good relationships with unstable countries thousands of miles away. The rest of Europe is finally catching up to what the French learned decades ago. If geography makes you vulnerable to energy blackmail, you need to change your energy systems, not your geography. Germany is the most dramatic example of this shift. For 20 years, German energy policy was built around two assumptions. Russian gas was reliable and cheap, and nuclear power was dangerous and unnecessary. The Ukraine war destroyed the first assumption, and Ukrainian strikes on the Caspian are destroying the second. German industry consumes enormous amounts of energy. Chemical plants, steel mills, automobile factories. These aren't the kinds of operations you can run on solar panels and wind turbines. They need massive, consistent baseload power. For the past 2 decades, that power came from burning Russian gas in highly efficient combined cycle plants. But Russian gas isn't cheap anymore, and it's definitely not reliable. German industry is discovering what happens when your energy supply depends on the strategic calculations of Vladimir Putin and the military effectiveness of Ukrainian drone operators. That's not an energy strategy. That's a hostage situation. Nuclear power plants, by contrast, don't depend on international supply chains or geopolitical stability in energy-producing regions. You build them once, fuel them with uranium that comes from politically stable countries like Canada and Australia, and they generate electricity for 60 years. The fuel costs are minimal, the supply chains are simple, and nobody can shut them down by bombing a pipeline in Central Asia. The economics of this shift are brutal but clear. Building nuclear plants requires massive upfront capital investment, but operating them is incredibly cheap, and the fuel costs are stable for decades. In a world where energy security matters more than short-term cost optimization, nuclear economics start to make perfect sense. Poland is already moving aggressively in this direction. They're building their first nuclear plants with American technology and financing, specifically to reduce dependence on energy imports from unstable regions. The Czech Republic is expanding its existing nuclear capacity for the same reasons. Even Germany, despite decades of anti-nuclear political rhetoric, is quietly reconsidering its phase-out plans. What's driving this shift isn't environmental ideology. It's the recognition that energy vulnerability is national security vulnerability. When Ukrainian drones can disrupt energy flows by hitting infrastructure in the Caspian, Europeans realize that their entire industrial base is vulnerable to military actions by countries they don't control. Nuclear power changes that calculation completely. Once you've built the plants, your energy security depends on your own engineering capabilities and political stability, not on maintaining good relationships with energy exporters or protecting supply lines that stretch across multiple conflict zones. The technology for this transition already exists. Modern nuclear reactor designs are safer, more efficient, and less expensive than the systems built during the Cold War. Countries like South Korea and France have demonstrated that nuclear construction can be done quickly and cost-effectively if you standardize designs and build multiple plants using the same technology. The financing is more challenging, but even that's becoming manageable. Nuclear plants require enormous upfront capital, but they also generate revenue for 60 years or more. In a world where energy security is a national priority, governments are willing to provide the guarantees and support necessary to make nuclear construction financially viable. What Ukraine's Caspian strikes really demonstrate is that the era of cheap, reliable energy imports is ending. Not because of climate policies or environmental regulations, but because of military realities. Energy infrastructure built for efficiency and cost optimization is catastrophically vulnerable in a world where drone technology has made precision strikes affordable and accessible. Europe can't change its geographic position or suddenly discover massive domestic oil and gas reserves, but it can build enough nuclear capacity to power its industrial base without depending on energy flows that can be disrupted by military action in regions it doesn't control. The irony is acute. Ukraine's success in striking Russian energy infrastructure is forcing Europe to become more energy independent, which ultimately makes European support for Ukraine more sustainable over the long term. If Europeans generate their own electricity with nuclear power, they don't need to worry about the geopolitical consequences of supporting Ukraine's military operations against Russian energy targets. This is what strategic independence looks like in practice. You don't achieve security by building more complex international relationships or more sophisticated diplomatic arrangements. You achieve security by reducing your dependence on systems that other people can disrupt. Ukrainian drones hitting the Caspian region aren't just tactical successes. They're forcing European energy policy to confront geographic realities that politicians spent decades trying to avoid. Europe is surrounded by unstable regions and doesn't have significant domestic energy resources. That combination makes energy imports a permanent vulnerability. Nuclear power doesn't eliminate that vulnerability entirely, but it reduces it to manageable proportions. Instead of depending on pipelines that cross multiple conflict zones and processing facilities that can be hit by increasingly sophisticated weapons, Europe can depend on technology it controls and uranium that comes from stable suppliers. The transition won't be quick or easy. Nuclear construction takes time, requires significant technical expertise, and faces political resistance in many countries. But the alternative is permanent vulnerability to energy blackmail by any country with sufficient military reach to disrupt supply lines. That's not a sustainable foundation for an advanced industrial economy. And as Ukrainian operations operations in the Caspian region are demonstrating, the military reach required to disrupt energy systems is becoming more accessible to more actors. The choice isn't between cheap energy and expensive energy. The choice is between vulnerable energy and secure energy. Europeans are finally recognizing that secure energy is worth paying for, even if it requires rebuilding their entire electricity generation system around nuclear technology. Geography doesn't care about your energy preferences or political commitments to particular technologies. Geography cares about physical resources, geographic distances, and military vulnerabilities. And geography is telling Europeans that nuclear power is their only realistic path to energy security in an increasingly unstable world. The drones over the Caspian are just the messenger. The message is that energy dependence is national suicide when weapons technology makes critical infrastructure vulnerable to attack from hundreds or thousands of miles away. Europeans are finally getting the message. The nuclear renaissance isn't coming because of environmental concerns or technological breakthroughs. It's coming because Ukrainian drones just demonstrated that imported energy is no longer a viable foundation for European industrial civilization. Geography decides, everything else is just wishful thinking.